We have two panelists today. We are very privileged. First is Dan Puchniak, of my colleague from National University of Singapore. He's on the far right. And the next panelist is Mr. Toshi Oguchi, from Representative Director, the Governance of Owners for Japan KK. So we are very privileged, and maybe they can share 5 minutes or to 10 minutes of their thoughts on the papers. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just like to start by really thanking ECGI, the organizers of this event. It's an honor and privilege to be here. And also really to thank Professor Coffey and Professor Beck for delivering extremely fascinating papers about shareholder activism. What I hope to do in the next hopefully less than 10 minutes, and please cut me off if I'm getting close, is to reorient the discussion a little bit. We've heard a paper on the United States and on the UK, but we're here at the EU-Asia Corporate Governance Dialogue, so I want to try to see if some of the main points in those papers apply to Asia. And I noticed in both Marco's talk, he mentioned Hong Kong, how he got feedback in Hong Kong. And in Professor Coffey's talk, he mentioned how hedge funds are moving to Korea. And I just want to ask the question, when we look at shareholder activism and we look at these papers, what can we take from them that we can apply in Asia as a whole or in some Asian jurisdictions? And the one point I want to make in the 5 minutes is I'm a bit skeptical about how much we can take. I think the findings on the individual countries are great, but I'm a little bit skeptical on how much is transferable, and I'll steal Professor Coffey's trick by limiting my arguments to 3 points. The first point is, I think shareholder activism is very jurisdiction specific. And let me run a thought experiment using their papers, okay? And I'll use Professor Coffey's paper first, with hedge funds being a wolf pack, okay? If I bring it home to Singapore, and we were to look at the black letter Singapore law, in fact, there's much more in the black letter Singapore law that would suggest wolf pack type hedge fund activists. What do I mean by that? In Singapore, you can't have a poison pill. In Singapore, you can remove the board at any time, regardless of what it says in your charter. In Singapore, you cannot, in listed companies, have staggered boards, full stop. So if you were to read the corporate law, you would think, we're going to have wolf packs everywhere. We would also think, yes, there are hedge funds in Singapore. Indeed, Singapore has become a center for hedge funds. But what can I tell you about Singapore? There's no wolf packs in Singapore. There are hedge funds. They're more like puppy dogs without teeth. And why is that the case? Well, that's the case because of the shareholder structure in Singapore. In Singapore, if you take the stock exchange, almost every listed company has a de facto or sometimes even full controlling shareholder. And in that sort of environment, it doesn't pay off to have this sort of activism, and you really haven't seen this sort of activism. Now, there has been certain types of activism, but it emerges in a much different way, and I don't have time in the 5 minutes to bring that up. Jurisdiction specific, going to Marco's paper. Again, he sort of brought up this point in the Hong Kong, but I'll reinforce it. When Marco was in the library researching the UK law in Singapore, he could have also flipped to the Singapore provisions. And if he flipped to the Singapore provisions, what he would have seen is that they're almost identical to the UK. And so you would think that empirically, you would have the same results in Singapore as the UK. Now, I haven't run the empirical tests, but my feeling is you're not going to get the same result. Again, it comes down to shareholder structure. Why? Because in Singapore, it's either state-owned enterprises or family-controlled firms have controlling shareholders. If they have controlling shareholders, we don't have, which he mentioned at the start of his talk and in his paper, we don't have the same problem of the CEO running off on their own to empire build. Now, I was glad that Marco brought up Hong Kong, and I agree with the point he made in Hong Kong. There may be some effect, but I doubt that it would be the same effect. when you're in this controlling shareholder environment. I could go into specific legal rules and other things, laws, institutions that would make it different, but I'll just stick with shareholder structure in the interest of time. The second point, which I think also builds on the main point about how transferable this is something I really loved about Professor Coffey's paper, and which he mentioned about Lucien Bebchuk in his paper, saying Bebchuk had it right 10 years ago, but not today. And I find this fascinating. Why? Because it shows that shareholder activism is not a static picture in any one jurisdiction. Even within the United States itself, and I think Professor Coffey, he clearly makes this point wonderfully in his paper, it's an evolution. He wouldn't have written this paper 10 years ago. Maybe he wouldn't have written it 5 years ago. In 10 years, he may not write the same paper at all. So what does this tell us? We're not only dealing with a problem of jurisdictions being very idiosyncratic, but also if we try to say shareholder activism is efficient or inefficient, or hedge fund activism in the United States today, Professor Coffey could come back here in 2 years and tell you the opposite because things have changed, right? And why is this important? Because people tend to take a static picture like the IMF and the World Bank to create what was brought up in the earlier presentation, global corporate governance standards. Those don't change every day. Those stay relatively static. Marco, I think, would agree to me. If we made a small tweak in those UK rules about the cutoffs, things could change dramatically. Just like that, shareholder activism changes. And so I'll end with my third point, which, if you buy into my first 2 points, that we have jurisdiction to jurisdiction great difference in shareholder activism, and if you believe that within each jurisdiction you get change over time, what does this mean? This means that you really have to examine on a case-by-case regular basis whether these things or how shareholder activism is working. And I can tell you, without having time to get into the details, it works fundamentally different in the UK and the US, which Professor Coffey very much rightly brought up in his paper. And I can tell you it works very much different in Singapore than the UK and the US. And I'm sure it works different in Japan than Singapore. Perhaps an overly simplistic point, but I suspect that within Asia you're not going to find this. And the final point what I would like to end on is my whole comparison is probably flawed because I've been speaking of Asia as a whole. And in fact, within Asia what you're going to see is Singapore is not Japan, India is not China. And this is a very confusing area, far more confusing for me to explain in 5 minutes, but even if you gave me hours, I probably couldn't do it either. So at that, I will end my comments, and hopefully it sparks some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Mr. Toshi. Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for all the ECGI and Mr. Professor Kanda to invited me. This very wonderful place to discuss this very interesting the issue. And first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Toshi Oguchi, running Governance Owner Japan. This is providing the engagement of services to the institutional investors just focus on the Japanese listed company, and also we are running the engagement fund together with our partner Tokyo Marine, focusing on the Japanese company. In this regard, first of all, I would like to say we are not hedge fund activists in accordance with the categorization. And thank you very much for both professor very interesting paper. And before coming here, I've just read your papers in hand. And if I understood correctly, the Marco, Professor Beck, saying that the mandatory voting about acquisition generated a substantial value improvement for the acquired shareholders. And Professor Coffey John says that so-called hedge fund activist has advanced, promoted, and accelerated the shift from the investment to the payout. I understand both on the common understanding that the shareholders are expected to exercise their influence or power for investment limiting intervene rather than investment encourage one. And because that, perhaps I must echo what you mentioned. I would like to share where we are now in Japan, just share what we are now in Japan. Japan, as you know, we are introduced the corporate governance code and the strategy code recently. And the last fiscal year, ending at the March, Japan paid out a record of dividend, 11 trillion Japanese yen, out of net income of 30 trillion yen. And at the same time announced a record of share buyback of more than 5 trillion yen. Those are record high. But at the same time, Japan has another record, which is the cash holdings. Still, the company, listed company in Japan, holding record to more than 100 trillion yen in cash, which is amount to the more than 10% of the total asset. So in this regard, can I say that this is a special market which investment limiting corporation management have a little pressure from the shareholder to promote the paying, shifting from investment to payout. This is a unique market or not? In order to this discussion, I'd like to say 3 points. First of all, maybe this might be, I echo the mentioned, this is a culture or society norm. Yes, Japan moving towards the so-called the shareholder, more pay attention to the shareholder. Having said that, the according to the Professor Coffey's paper, the drastic shift from the investment to payout could work at the region where the norm of shareholder primacy work. So in this regard, I don't think Japan actually have not adopted such a norm and will not suspect Japan will take such a norm in the future. Still Japan will take a so-called stakeholder capitalism or including the shareholder. So therefore, from that perspective, in the economical perspective, so-called hedge fund activism or so-called event-driven strategy focus on the liquidity still lead high cost in Japan. Therefore, because of lack of support from the society in Japan. So therefore, from this regard, still I'm a little skeptical about this type of hedge fund activism will work in Japan as they have done in the United States. That is one point. And the second point is relationship and mindset between the shareholder and corporate management. According to those professors' presentation, those are based upon the promises that the management is rather overconfident, while the investors are rather cautious about the investment. However, that may be right in their country, but in Japan they have some different aspect. As I mentioned, Japan introduced the corporate governance code, and corporate governance code professes itself to be a growth-oriented corporate governance, because it encourages corporate management to use money for the sustainable growth in the future, and the investor should help that in direction. That concept of the two code. And according to the Professor Coffey's paper, saying that the composition of the shareholders owning the firm generally affect the firm's investment horizon. That means the portion of the long-term investors are bigger than the short-term investors, lead to encourage the company to pay more long-term investors. So if that's the case, the question, and given that those attitude of investors and corporation are right, the question is how to common incentive, how to incentive to link between the corporate management and long-term shareholders. That's the second point which I want to mention. Lastly, as I mentioned, from that perspective, you both are talking about some sort of the hard law issue, like to stop something. But in Japan, we are decided to adopted so-called comply explain rules or soft law approach under the name of corporate governance code, under such code. And interestingly, this is the same word, sustainable growth, in the jointly in those subtitles. The formal title is the corporate governance code under such code, but under that, they're saying this is try to aim at the sustainable growth of corporate. That
so
one,
more long-term.
yes.
Long-term looking.
That's the reason why those codes are well accepted by Japanese, both from the corporation and investors. Having said that, this is not a law. This is just comply explain, based soft law. And the question or challenge for Japan is, under this soft law, we can actually achieve the aimed target without any forces. And also, lastly, now I'm a little bit unclear about what the ultimate goal of the ideal relationship between shareholders and the corporation. I understand your country have moved toward, rather than accelerate the payment rather than investment. But what the ideal balance between the investment and payout is already on the agenda to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, yes, all right. Maybe you can just comment on the comments.
Yeah, so let me first comment on Dan. So first of all, the study I presented is not really about shareholder activism. It's really about referendum voting. And whether this is the threshold is 25% or 28% or 30%, that doesn't really matter. Now, so that was my first response. Now, on Asia, I think the real question is, or in general, does it make sense to think about a referendum vote on anything? I think the first question you have to ask is there a problem? I think in the US we have, very well documented problem that companies make bad acquisitions, so there's a problem. In the UK you also have this problem. I actually don't know about Asia. I don't know, for example, in Japan, which has a widely held shareholdership in general, whether in Japan you have an acquisitions problem. So namely, companies make, on the whole, bad acquisitions. If that was the case, then you have to think about solving that problem. Now, I also don't know about countries that have family-controlled companies in Asia, whether they have the same acquisition problem as the widely held. So that would be the first question to ask, and then you can ask, would this particular rule potentially solve their problem or not? Now, on your statement about activism, that it depends on the country and it depends on the law. The study that Jack kindly mentioned, we have actually a new result that suggests, and it covers Asia, that suggests that the law actually, I'm sorry, Dan, to say, doesn't matter that much. So what do we find what matters for hedge fund activism worldwide? It really works when the hedge fund activist can bring a proxy fight, so challenge board control, and has a chance to win, which is what Jack said is the case in the US. Whenever that's the case, there is a good case for bringing hedge fund activism. So what are the factors that contribute to that working? Well, one is that the law must actually give you access to a board election, but we saw that's true actually in most jurisdictions. The second thing you need is potential support from other shareholders. Why do you need that? Because the hedge fund activists cannot go up. They can occasionally, but generally either because of poison pills or because of mandatory bid thresholds or what have you, they cannot go to 30, 40%. They need allies. And there are two kinds of allies that they can have. Other hedge funds, in comes the wolf pack, or more importantly, other shareholders, institutional shareholders. And who are the institutional shareholders who are most friendly to hedge fund activists? US institutional shareholders. And that's exactly what we find in the study. When you have a high concentration in the company, when it's widely held, and the float is in the hand of US institutions, you're more likely to get a hedge fund activist come in. And then it doesn't matter whether you are in Tokyo or in Singapore or in Seoul or wherever it is. When you have these factors combined, you get hedge fund activism. If you want to shut it down, by the way, Jack, I think your list is good. But what's even more important is you shut down the proxy fight, like the Dutch do, okay, sometimes, and then it's gone, okay? Your thing is tinkering with it. If you really want to stop it, you have to get to the proxy fight. Anyway, now turn it to Jack, so, you know.
You've just told us if we end democracy, we'll have no problems with democracy. I think that's probably correct, but not dispositive. Okay. I want to be very clear. I'm not being defensive here. I thoroughly agree with our first commentator.
Just speak into it.
Okay. Our first commentator is entirely right, but let's be careful about the extent to which he is right. The U.S. is at one end of a polar continuum in terms of the structure of share ownership. The typical U.S. board speaks for about 5%, 6% of the total shares. That is, all the directors and their wives and children own about 5 or 6%. That the other side of that, there on the other end of that continuum, there'll be no shareholder activism at all. In between, there's a great big open ground. This was something that LLS&V showed about 10 years ago when they charted the amount of dispersed ownership. And there is some dispersed ownership in all of the world. And I was going to point more thoroughly to Marco's paper because he does show that there are cases of activism all around the globe where you find the board doesn't control a majority or even a plurality of the stock, and it's possible to put together an activist, typically with American institutional investors who are diversified around the world. U.S. investors diversified globally a long time ago, and so you can often get a U.S. institutional investor, not an activist, but institutional investor block of 25 or 30% in many, many companies. And that could be activated. So while it's not knocking on your door, it's not something that's more than 2 steps away to the extent that you are seeing companies with less than control locked up with just a large block around the board of directors and institutional investors willing to listen. Now, I also want to agree with the second point everybody is saying. Law matters less than law professors like to believe. And the first fact was the structure of share ownership matters a lot. But other things will matter, including culture. We're finding that in England, we're not seeing the same level of hedge fund activism. Why? It looks like the institutional investors in the UK aren't as willing to sign on with the hedge fund activists. It may be they don't listen to ISS as much. In the US, if ISS goes out there and agrees with the activists, they speak for probably the voting power of 50% of the stock in the hands of the large diversified institutional investors. They don't have the same impact in the UK, even though there isn't control in most of those UK companies. So I think we're seeing something that could be seen in the future. You may be safe, but on the other hand, having concentrated ownership is an imperfect remedy. because concentrated ownership means a certain amount of rents, a certain amount of other problems. Be careful which disease you pick. And if you have the disease of totally dispersed ownership, I do think you want to make sure you don't encourage excessive activism on behalf of people who don't have to plan their strategy because they can get a 6 or 7% return the week they file and don't have to worry too much further. Okay, I can make some other points, but I think they're just small variations on this. I don't say that I gave you a paper that says this is going to happen around the world, but I think around the world in many countries you're going to see some instances of dispersed ownership, and you're going to eventually find the hedge funds full of cash seeking out every little such case. They are running around Australia as we speak looking for companies, but they can't seem to get the diversified institutions to sign on with them, and that's a problem about the culture of all this. Okay, at this point, let me turn it over and let the audience comment.
Yes. Yes, can we pass it to the audience? With the audience, yes.
Thank you very much. Very nice discussion. My name is Naoki Yoshino again, Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute. I would like to tell 2 stories about culture in Asia. In Japan, there was a very good small and medium-sized sake brewery company. Then European investor came to Japan. Why don't you sell your products much more to Europe or United States? Then the president said, I don't want to expand so much because I want to see old product line by my own eyes. And then he wants to control his sake brewery very well. So there are so many SMEs who could expand much more but wants to maintain their size. And they don't want to go into stock market. So that is one. Secondly, they want to rely on some medium-sized companies want to issue their stocks, but they always keep bank loans in case of some emergency. Because last resort, they think always regional banks will keep on lending money. They will never flew away because their companies are always within the region. So in many cases, they think stock market is very good, but it is not a major part of the investors. So that is, I think, Asian culture, especially in Japan. So why is it so different from US and Asia? So those are.
Would you say that Asia? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, let me ask you the question the other way around. I mean, you know, it was mentioned that Japanese companies hold so much cash, which is a phenomenon. I mean, there must be a reason for this. People are sophisticated in this country. There must be a reason why the companies hold so much cash. I mean, during the financial crisis, everybody looked to Asia and said, look, they are very wise. They hold cash, and we can't get our bank loans now. If we held cash, that would be a good thing. Yeah, is that the reason, being afraid of crisis and liquidity drying up? What's the reason?
Whenever I talk to the company who have much cash, yes, right, they are saying that they, just in case. But in that case, yes, you have a strong cash flow, and you don't need such a cash in hand. And when needed, please borrow the banks. That's what we suggest. But again, this is sort of the culture issue, the mindset. But this is not good. So therefore, as I said earlier, we need some linkage to encourage corporate management to take mid to long-term risk. So the one idea which I think in my mind is to introduction of the performance share linked to the performance in terms of the not short term, but 3 to 5 years, which recently some companies have adopted. So the short-term so-called equity linked to performance mechanisms, it leads management to focus on short-term performance. And my colleague said, if company are more try to take some sort of such a short-term performance, they are afraid Japan also seeks some same phenomenon happening in United States to encourage shift from investment to payout. Therefore, I'm not sure, but one idea which I have to think seriously is the very much remuneration package linked to mid-term to long-term corporate performance rather than short-term performance.
Yeah. Just a tiny brief comment on the culture point, which I think Professor Coffey talked about a bit between the US and the UK, and you brought up. And I would just like to echo this point, having spent a fair amount of time in Japan and then Singapore, that the culture, the business culture, I don't know if I want to define it more widely as general culture, but certainly the business culture in Singapore is quite a bit different than the business culture in Japan. And I think it has a very significant impact on a whole host of different issues from all parts of corporate governance. To give a simple example, in Singapore, the head of the stock exchange, you could probably never picture in Japan a foreigner being the head of the stock exchange, or on the sovereign wealth fund, there's many prominent foreigners who are independent directors. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that there are clearly different cultural differences in terms of risk-taking, acceptance of activism, shareholder primacy, and they're dynamic and they change, and Singapore's culture is not the same now as it was at independence, but they're very real, and it's just difficult to quantify, but important.
One last word. I think we should be cautious about these generalizations because the experience is so young. China has about a 10-year history with corporate governance. India has less than that in terms of what I think India will look like in 10 more years. And other countries could change under shock. Different things could happen. Right now, the role of the state is clear, although how it quite works we're not clear on, but we know the role of the state is critical in China. I don't know 30 years from now that it'll be that same strong force. And we could see different structures of share ownership, and I think activist investors can move across borders quicker than anyone else if we saw significant structures in both the power of the state or the structure of share ownership. So may we live in interesting times. I think sooner or later we will.
And I think for Japan, the corporate governance is only for the last 2 or 3 years. It has only started, the awareness of corporate governance. So I think over the next few years, we'll still see more, and there may be more and more changes to Japan's corporate landscape. Yes, Curtis.
Thank you. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on the culture point. I think I'm not averse to cultural explanations, but I think we can push on a little bit farther in the Japanese case, the question about why Japanese corporations stockpile so much cash. I think a lot of this, at least in my view, goes back or can be tied to the labor system. And so you don't have lateral labor mobility in Japan, and partly here I think law does matter because the courts have made it difficult to lay off workers even in times of financial distress. So, and I think in a system where managers have risen through the ranks of employees, there's a strong identification by managers with labor. They can't lay off workers very easily, and so naturally you would want to have a cushion for the firm. So yes, that's culture, but you can tie it to an institutional environment. I wanted to ask, I found this discussion very fascinating, and I kept thinking about Japan with respect to it. So Marco tells us that where you have these various factors, a proxy contest is possible. The hedge funds have allies, particularly U.S. institutional investors. You will see activism. Well, that describes Japan, right? I think proxy contests are possible here. There's no staggered boards. There's no real legal impediment to proxy contests here. There's heavy U.S. institutional share ownership in Japan, and yet we don't see much activism. And so I guess it's really a question for Sir Oguchi. I took from your remarks that it's a mindset issue or a social, cultural issue. Are there other barriers? Why don't we see more activism here, given the fact that the legal environment seems open to it, and there's strong or significant U.S. institutional ownership?
Thank you very much. My answer could be part have changed before the corporate governance code introduction and after corporate governance introduction, actually we have had such a third error regarding the Japanese corporation attacked by so-called hedge fund activists. What has happened is that many companies try to introduce a poison pill. The more than 500 companies introduced poison pill to protect themselves from such a so-called hedge fund activism. And at the time, that did not work well, right? And after that, the introduction of the corporate governance code and the search code, the mindset have changed. But question whether the Japanese corporations are ready to such a radical attack in front of the people. To be honest, I have no idea at the moment.
Or maybe for the gentleman first. Yeah, yes. And then after that.
Hello, my name is Kenichi Ueda at the University of Tokyo, and well, have been until 2 years ago. I have been working at IMF and a little bit involving on this kind of issues.
Can you speak louder? Yeah.
Okay. And well, I have a few comments and a few maybe questions. One, first, I do, as far as I know from the data, corporate cash holdings has been especially increased in around early 2000, at least up to the financial crisis happened. Not just in Japan, but in all G7 countries, especially other G7 countries, rapidly increased to the level similar to, I believe, in Japan's corporation level. So it's not just a Japan's issue, and which I wrote a report in around mid-2000 on IMF World Economic Outlook about this. And as far as I know, one of the factors that correlated with it is it looks like increase of M&As. Because M&As, and also I believe you cannot really identify which is inside, because what we call cash in account balance sheet is really also including all the marketable securities, including stocks of other companies. When they only have a minority stakes, they could be appeared, looks like, as a cash. And the other issue is a pension. Some companies need to put aside some pension inside kind of company balance sheet, like GM or Toyota have lots of pension money, kind of. And that actually have to own lots of marketable securities, like treasury bond and so on. But anyway, that's I'm not really, I myself not so satisfied with that kind of study. But anyway, my sense is that it's not just Japan culture issue, it's more worldwide issue, that's one. The second issue of the kind of relationship with the bank loans and stock market. We know also some other economists work that in general that's complementary. Whenever market cap is bigger country, usually bank loans are also big in terms of GDP. So it's not just substitute. Usually it's a complement. So it's substitution point of view is a little bit kind of, I think, older point of view, but it's we have to think about more like complementary point of view. That's one. My question, coming back to my question on this stuff is really, I know this, having heard about lots of discussions here, that essentially the hedge fund activism really influencing many parts of the world, mainly because, as Professor Coffey said, US hedge funds are reaching globally many places. And then if that's the case, in the other countries, maybe should have some say on US legal or some other regulation kind of issues, which I believe we don't have to do, because I believe overall US institution more or less doing, having a good laws and regulations. So the next question, however, is somewhat Professor Coffey said, in 10 years, maybe those US hedge funds might be replaced by the Chinese state-owned funds. That's more like a problem, I believe, because in that case, we want to say more about Chinese laws and regulation, but which we probably cannot influence much on it. And something like this is kind of my concern, kind of popping up concern right now. So I would like to know your kind of comments on these issues.
I have a very poor hearing, so I may not have heard much of that question. But I think you were asking about what differences in law might slow down the coalition you fear between activist hedge funds and American institutional investors who are globally diversified. All right. I think you were asking me whether other countries, including countries in Asia, need some statutory protection that might protect them against this dangerous coalition of American hedge funds and American institutional investors. Now, that coalition has not yet been observed working in any place in Asia, maybe a slight bit in a couple of cases. But before we worry about it, let me point out some of the legal problems that may make it difficult. If you go to Australia, they will tell you that if an American hedge fund starts tipping people that it's going to file the equivalent of the 13D under Australian law, that will be seen as insider trading. So there are countries in which the formation of such a coalition may amount to insider trading. That's not the case in the U.S., it's not the case in some other countries, but you can adjust your law as you want. And I think tipping that I'm putting together a group could be defined, if you want to define it, as insider trading. I'm not recommending that you do that. I would prefer that you focus on the definition of group. I think not that it should not be impossible to put people together to try to challenge management. I don't want to, and calling it insider trading effectively precludes it, but I think they should have to be disclosed as a group. I think there's such conscious parallelism in the behavior of people who suddenly appear on one day and have bought all the stock the day before that I think they should have to disclose in advance that they are a group, and that gives management more time, and it would change the balance of advantage. So I think there are those kind of rules. I think you come up with still, I left out all my changes in U.S. law, but I think you can play with a number of the provisions of existing law, and I think you would need to focus on your rules about disclosure of beneficial ownership. That's not been of great concern in countries with concentrated ownership because probably the incumbent forces don't want to disclose this. But if you started finding foreign allies forming secretly and descending upon you, I think you should increase the tightness of your rules on disclosure of beneficial ownership. There are lots of things you can do in that regard. I just don't think I heard the rest of your question, so I can't fully respond to it.
I think the second question was actually whether in 10 years' time the Chinese funds may take over the U.S. hedge funds. I think your second question was actually in 10 years' time whether the Chinese, like, you know, their funds and all that kind of thing may take over the U.S. hedge funds.
No.
I don't know.
No.
I think that was
your answer is quite correct.
If they'll buy my stock at a premium, please come.
No, my question was, currently we are probably fine with U.S. hedge fund activism, because they are not doing so much harm, I believe. But the problem was in 10 years' time with the Chinese funds coming.
I think if you developed a large number of Chinese hedge funds, you would find that some of them would begin to think about playing the game of activist investment. You have to realize that American hedge funds were around for 30 or 40 years before they thought of this. They were busy being quantitative funds, focusing on logarithmic techniques for exploiting small variations in stock prices across markets. And they realized, gee, these companies are so terrible over here, all you have to do is break them up and we can get 100% gain. And it could well be that China would not tolerate foreign hedge funds, but might tolerate domestic hedge funds as a way for conducting an undertaking process for failed Chinese companies. I don't know that it'll work that way, but among scenarios, that's better than letting the foreigners do it, which would be much more politically sensitive. So the idea of breaking a company up to realize negative synergy is an economic idea that might someday get implemented in other countries as well. Or I think that's an answer.
Thanks.
Just one small add-on point, and to steal a technique from Professor Coffey, an explanatory technique again. I think it's important to put Japan on a continuum within Asia, because it falls on the extreme of the continuum when we look at shareholding structure. That Japan clearly stands out, not only in Asia, but within the world empirically, in terms of dispersion rates with the US and the UK. Now, of course, cross-shareholding is an issue, but that's been unwound. And so it is one of the environments where hedge funds, if they are going to have a chance of succeeding at a great level in Asia, it would be here much more in Japan. As you move out of Japan and you look throughout the tiger economies, India, China, you find a much more similar structure between those jurisdictions. Now, structure isn't everything. Of course, we talked about law and culture, institutions. There's a whole bunch of other things for sure. But just on that continuum, I think at least the empirical possibility is much more alive in Japan, in addition to the empirical possibility because US ownership, and especially foreign ownership, spiked so much from the early 90s, and that level of increase, there's an increase in foreign ownership all around the world. That's a trend. But in Japan, also Japan is on the far end of the continuum.
Maybe just one little thing. I think outside US, in a lot of jurisdictions, we have this takeover laws. If you group together and buy a certain stock, you may be acting in concert, and they will be counted together. And that may trigger off what we call mandatory bid. Yes.
Tell you on that point.
Okay.
Acting in concert is
Yes.
in the hands of the lawyers.
All
and
right.
lawyers will sit there and write boilerplate.
Yeah.
They'll say, we are not
Acting in concert. Yes. All right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Lulu, I'm afraid empirically it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. So, okay. All right. Okay. Thank you so much. I'll take it. All right. Okay.
Wolfpacks.
Yes. Wolfpacks still there. Okay. I think thank you very much for our panelists and our speakers for a very lively discussion. And I think our time is up. We will be having our break. And before that, can we just put our hands together and thank our speakers and panelists? Thank you.